I have been reading in my personal devotions through the book of Matthew. And so I'm in Matthew 5 and 6 this past week. And just as Laura was saying, right in line with what I was thinking, that some things in Scripture just don't seem to make sense. And I was struck, especially this week, and I've read this, I don't know how many times, but I was struck in the fact that Jesus was so countercultural in his preaching. More than that, his teaching goes against a lot of how we were taught. I mean, I was raised that if somebody hits you, you hit them back. Jesus said, turn the other cheek. If someone hates you and is mean to you, well, then they just don't hang around them. But Jesus says, love them. In Matthew, the phrase is constantly brought out as Jesus is preaching through Matthew 5 and 6. You have heard it said. And then he would finish it, but I say to you. And it's constantly countercultural. And then he starts talking about loving your enemies. Really? I mean, isn't that kind of crazy talk? Love your enemies? Luke 6, 27, 36, same story. Luke says it a little bit differently, and he says some things that I want to bring out. So I'm going to read Luke 6, 27 to 36. And I think as we examine it, it's shocking. It goes against the grain of how most of us feel and think. Listen. But to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on one cheek, turn to them the other also. If someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them. Give to everyone who asks, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love you, who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And if you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. But love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, because he is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. What strikes me about Luke's passage is the very first line. But to you who are listening, I say. Jesus begins this whole section, this whole sermon, by identifying his audience. Just a few verses before, we learned that Jesus was up on a mountainside and he was praying all night, and he picked his disciples there. And he taught. And then a huge crowd had come to this level place. And so he goes off the mountainside into the plain. This is often called the Sermon on the Plain. And he starts teaching. He gives the blessings and the woes. And then he goes on and he says, but to you who are listening. I thought that was a little bit strange. He's been preaching to these people for a while now. He's been speaking to them. He comes down off the mountain specifically to teach them. And then he says, But to you who are listening, I don't know. Surely everyone's listening, right? That's why they came, to hear what he had to say. Why would he say something like that? Well, let me ask you, how many of us, once we begin to hear something that sounds countercultural, counterintuitive, unrealistic to us, something we disagree with, how many of us tune it out? We've all been there, and it's especially prevalent right now in our society. Someone tells us they're a liberal and they follow a liberal agenda. We immediately tune out what they have to say next. We tune it out because they're liberals. We do it with a lot of different teaching. We immediately stand against their thinking because it goes against what we think. More than that, we are often more internally against them and looking at them as our enemy. We aren't looking to hear anything from them. In fact, a lot of us, what's going on in our minds is, how am I going to take my stand against them? What am I going to say to counter their thoughts? We're not thinking, I need to love this person. I ask you, how do we do that? In fact, I don't even think Jesus is countercultural. I think Jesus is counter-human nature. Jesus just flipped cultural understandings on the head through his message, a blessing to the least of society and his woes to those who would seem as blessed in society. So Jesus is now focusing and he's speaking to those people who are still on board with him, because some of them has tuned him out. And to that end, he establishes some really challenging ideas. So for those of us who want to follow Jesus, who want to see his kingdom established, who are the ones still listening to him, the question for all of us is, are we? So he says, love your enemy. Who is my enemy? This command wasn't and still isn't for people who are faint of heart. This is a tall order that Jesus is giving to his followers. Remember, they are standing with another nation controlling them. Not only that, but this teaching, it wakes up, it provokes several difficult questions that we have to try and answer. The first being, who is my enemy? Jesus tells me to love my enemy, but how can I do that if I don't know who my enemy is? Some people have grown up, we were taught in church that we should never hate people because hating people means that you want them dead. Which sounds extreme, and I'm sure that extreme tactic worked, because who would want anyone else dead? So we try not to hate anyone. And that leads some people to never really think of anyone as their enemy. Because if I had an enemy, probably I'd hate them. So who is Jesus talking about in society, both inside and outside the church? I see two clear possibilities. For many of us, especially Christians, we probably don't feel that we have a lot of personal enemies, right? I mean, if I asked all of you who's your enemy, I bet you some of you would scratch your head. You really couldn't come up with many names. Maybe some. My guess is only a handful of you could tell me who's your real enemy. It feels sort of unchristian-like to consider someone an enemy. But culturally, Christian or not, we are very quick to identify impersonal enemies, national enemies, whether they be opposing political party or ideology, or even people that we have never had contact with, but we disagree with them. So we're quick to sort of demonize them and view them as the enemy. But what kind of enemy is Jesus talking about here? Well, the word that Jesus uses in the Greek is ekthros, and it's found throughout the Bible. Most frequently when it's used, it's talking about an impersonal, a national, a civic enemy, the opposing nation or political party, Rome, for example. It's also frequently used for identifying a personal enemy. The person that's out to get you at every turn. And given the frequent use of both different ways, I believe Jesus is incorporating both the concept of our national and civic enemies, but also telling us about our personal enemies. And what he does is he tells us to love them both. To love them both. Both the national enemy, the civic enemy, but also the people we consider out of their minds for some beliefs and ideologies they hold, as well as the person who's out to get us at every turn. Have you ever had someone in your life like that? I have several times. And quite honestly, it's frustrating and it hurts a lot. I have to love them. Despite our immediate inclinations to real quickly identify people as national enemies, impersonal enemies, it, I think, can be difficult for us as Christians to identify people as personal enemies, as our personal enemies. We don't like to use those kinds of words. We don't care for them very much. Hate's a strong word, and I know I probably wouldn't use it. I'm sure probably you wouldn't. But what actually is the truth? I have people who have come in and out of my life that I couldn't stand. You have people like that? You avoid them like COVID. Did I or do I hate them? I hope not, but you know what? It sure seems close sometimes. Not long ago, I had to give a lesson, a driving lesson, and take this particular 28-year-old woman to her road test. And to start off with, her lesson time, she came 45 minutes late to. That means I got 15 minutes to get her over to the road test site for the end of that lesson. I went an extra 5 minutes. I gave her a 20-minute lesson. And during that time, she was doing some things that were wrong, and I kept correcting her, and she kept doing them wrong. And I'm getting a little aggravated when you're saying, okay, don't do this, don't do that, and they keep doing this and keep doing that. And then we got out on the road test line, and there was quite a few cars. Now we have to wait probably 45 minutes because of the line. And as we get in the line, she looks at me, she goes, I'm thirsty, I need some water. I said, well, I'm really sorry, but I don't have any water bottles or anything here. She goes, I need water. And she was very insistent. So I said, all right, you know what, we'll get off the line. We're going to have to wait a little bit longer. We'll get off the line, and there's a deli up the block. I went to that deli up the block, and I pulled in the parking lot, and I just said, okay, why don't you run in and get your water? She goes, I don't have any money. Oh, sure. By this time, I'm kind of aggravated with her. And so I said, fine, I'll get you some water. I ran in, got her a bottle of water, gave it back to her. We went and got back online. We had to wait our 45 minutes. And then we get up to the road test site, and the examiner happened to be a friend. I was very friendly with him. And I get out of my car and I walk around because I have to get my jacket out of the back. It's wintertime. And as I come back up to her, standing in front of the examiner, Mark, the examiner, has given me these eyes, these wide eyes, and I'm like, what did I do wrong? Of course, I didn't say that, but he's just giving me these eyes, and then she gets in the car, he gets in the car, they take the road test, and then as he gets out of the car after the road test, he's giving me the same eyes, and he walks past me. I said, see you, Mark. I'll see you later. I got another road test later on. And I get in the car, and this girl is cursing this examiner up and down because he failed her. And so I take her little ticket, and I look at it, and I say, well, you know what? Some of these things were some of the things you were doing wrong before. Now, her anger shifts from him to me. I have to drive her back home in White Plains, so I have a 15-minute drive ahead of me. And as I am, and I've never experienced this before, she is cursing me out a foot from my face to the point where I couldn't say anything back. And you know me. I always have words to be able to say back. I was speechless. And she did not stop. The stuff that came out of her mouth, brutal. And she was screaming at me and screaming at me and screaming at me. And finally, I said, do you want to go back to the office or to your house? My house. And she said, it's right up the block. I pulled over on the side of the road at this point because I had had enough. And I said, okay, you can walk. And she was angry. She got out. She slammed the door. And as she's walking away with her water bottle, I opened up my window and I said, by the way, you're welcome. And she came back, opened the door, and said, get me in the car, take me up to my house. I don't want to owe you nothing. And I said, no, you're not getting back into the car. So long. I went back to the office, and I immediately walked in, and I said to my boss and the office staff, I said, do not ever give me that girl again. And I don't think we should give her any lessons at all anymore. And I explained what happened. I couldn't stand her. At that moment, she was my enemy. This was a hard realization for me to come to. One that I don't really like making, especially since I'm supposed to be a pastor. It felt so wrong to hate her, but it felt so right. And I know that sounds shocking, maybe coming from a pastor. It feels very anti-Jesus, but hear me out. When we identify people as our enemies, it changes things. When I came to identify this young girl as my enemy, it should have changed how I looked at her. It should have changed how I prayed for her. It should have caused me to ask God regularly to help her. I considered her my enemy, and Jesus called me to love her despite my displeasure with that idea. But I admit, I failed to identify her as my enemy at that time. Just a girl that I wanted no part of. She was a jerk and she had issues. All I could think is, I don't ever want to interact with her again. But I should have done better. If we fail to identify people as our enemies, we deny this teaching of Jesus here. If we don't think we have any enemies, we're just deceiving ourselves. And I'm sure each one of us can come up with a list of people that we don't want to pray for, that we don't want to bless in any sense of the word, but we won't call them our enemy. Our enemy is anyone or anything who we don't want to love, period. When when we don't honestly admit they're enemies, in a sense, we're saying this passage doesn't apply to me. I don't have any enemies. So I ask, who is your enemy? When we identify them, we force ourselves to reconcile what Jesus is teaching here, which leads to the second question that this passage brings up. What does it look like to love my enemies? How can I love my enemy? Thankfully, Jesus helps answer this question too. He gives us 4 commands, imperatives, to those of us who are listening on how to respond to our enemies. Jesus is once again, he's overturning these cultural norms, these conventional norms, and he's asking us to respond to our enemies in a sort of unorthodox way that we're not used to. And it's going to get uncomfortable if we choose to follow his instructions. I mean, really uncomfortable. We might even argue with him about it. And you know what? That's okay with him. It's okay if we argue with him about it. Because he knows the results are going to be amazing. They're going to be beyond comprehension, not only in them, but in us. I've taken this teaching to heart, and I've seen some of my enemies become my friends. Imagine that. Jesus calls us to love our enemies generously. What do I mean by that? Jesus first calls us in these commands. He commands that he gives in the beginning of this message. He says to love them, to do good by them, to bless them, and to pray for them. These commands, they're a call to us for action. Love isn't an intellectual thing. It's not strictly having a good feeling for someone. Both those things come into play with love, sure. But love is an action that we choose to do. When Jesus calls us to love one another as he has loved us, he calls us to live like he lived, to do good to others, to see them elevated and succeed. The love that Jesus calls us to is one that moves, one that acts, one that is generous. And Jesus gives some practical examples in this passage about that, what it looks like to help to love our enemies generously. Look at verses 29 to 30. He says, when somebody slaps us on the cheek, turn to them the other. Well, I think there's some debate on what exactly Jesus is saying here, whether the slap is an injury to our character or an actual blow to our face. Jesus isn't focusing on the type of assault, but on the response. We're to respond to the assault with an offering of generosity, not resistance. Responding this way it means that we don't reciprocate evil, but instead we choose to reject the cycle of evil and confront it with love. The second part of this illustration reveals further Jesus' desire for his disciples, his followers, to love generously. He says, if someone takes our coat, don't withhold the shirt, but give to them. And he says, but give to them without restraint. This is countercultural to our thinking, right? And it is. This generous love ceases to offer resistance in order to eliminate the cause of the aggression. Michelle Obama once said, and it was good, she said, when they, in this case our enemies, go low, we go high. Now, let me stop here for a moment. Many of you, when I said Michelle Obama, you kind of tuned that out, right? Because you're not an Obama fan. Be honest with you, neither am I. But the truth is, what she said is correct. And frankly, in that quote, and I'm using it now, Jesus is calling us to a higher ethic. One where we love our enemy with overwhelming generosity.
That means even our enemy can speak the truth.
What?
That means even our enemies can speak the truth.
Yeah, we speak the truth, even to our enemies. Yep. It seems difficult, it seems foolish that this will actually work, to love them generously. But it does. And that's the idea. When we look through history at the evidence of the power of love to transform the world, there was a guy named Gandhi. Gandhi responded to injustice in his time by peacefully resisting the aggressors, speaking the truth. But yet he did it lovingly. And he shamed them into repentance. And his actions forced them to reconcile with the evil inside themselves and ultimately to the liberation of India from the British rule. Martin Luther King Jr., he led peaceful protests, speaking honestly, but it shook our nation in the best way. It led to civil rights for humanity and blacks and whites. And Jesus isn't saying we don't speak the truth against evil, but to love those who embrace it, our enemies. This generous love toward our enemies is summed up in verse 31. The moral standard of the time, often, still today, do to others what they do to you. Someone slaps you in the face, you slap them back. But once again, Jesus bucks convention and invites his followers to kind of go higher. Do to others what you want them to do to you. Jesus places the responsibility on us, his followers, to not simply refrain from evil, but to model generous love toward our enemies. I know Jesus is already asking a whole lot of us to love our enemies generously. It's a hard thing to do. But let's face it, Jesus is saying it's going to be a worthy and a world-transforming practice. But there's one more piece that we need to look at if we're fully love our enemy. Loving generously without expecting anything in return. Within our world, there is a common, understood law of psychology. And it's used throughout the business world. We see it every day in our lives. What I'm talking about is this law of reciprocity. Basically, the idea that when someone does something for us, we do it back for them. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. We have this deep-rooted desire to do a favor for a favor. There's a scene in, I don't know how many of you have ever watched The Office. I rarely have watched it, but I saw one where, this is the scene, a guy named Dwight, he brings bagels in for everybody, and he brings these bagels in order to secretly solicit favors from his coworkers. But one of them, Andy, is so taken with his kindness, and Andy can't stand to be outdone with politeness, that he actually shines Dwight's briefcase. And this escalates into literally a feud where they're continually trying to up one another and do favors for each other the rest of the episode. But the law makes sense that Jesus has given to us. It's natural to love those who love us and to be good to those who are good to us. But Jesus is establishing this sort of new reality for us. And he's saying, no, I want you to be good to those that do bad. For you and I who are listening to Jesus' words, then we are to love generously without expecting anything in return. Jesus says there's nothing wrong with loving those who love us, citizens of the kingdom. He's telling us to take an extra step and to love generously those who don't like us, who are our enemies, without expecting anything in return. Jesus hammers the idea home, and he says, what credit is that to you to love those who love you? That's what's normal in the world. I'm asking you to go above that. But to those who want to be part of God's kingdom, we're not to have ulterior motives in doing good, in loving someone else. You and I are called into God's kingdom, are called to love without strings attached, especially our enemies. Jesus outlines the results of this kind of love. If we live this way and love generously with no strings attached, we will be rewarded as children of God. We are children of God when we imitate Jesus' character. Jesus says that God is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked, that the Father is merciful, and we too need to be merciful. And it's true, right? Jesus demonstrated that power of his love on the cross. The whole Bible is a story of God loving his enemies. You and I were enemies of God because of sin. And he constantly and generously loved us without getting anything in return. So much to the point that he was willing to give his only son to be pierced and subjected to death on our behalf. He died on the cross for our sin. We were recognized by God even when we were his enemies. We recognized him and loved generously and called children. He didn't have any strings attached to his love. So how do we do this? Jesus talked about his yoke being easy and his burden being light. But this feels like so hard to do. So here's 3 things that I think we can all begin to do. Number 1, this is going to be hard for some of us. Identify your enemies. The first thing that you can do to begin to love generously without expecting return payment is to begin to identify who your enemies are. Honestly consider people in your life you really don't get along with. Yeah, think about the personal enemies and also the impersonal enemies, the religious groups that you consider an enemy. Those individuals that you don't like. And him. They might even be part of your own family. Don't let fear of sounding unchristian by calling someone your enemy deter you, because remember, when we identify someone as our enemy, it changes how we look at them, or it should. And we are called to follow Jesus. So identify your enemies. Secondly, pray for your enemies. Prayer changes the way that we view people. The second thing is to begin to pray for them. C.S. Lewis, he said that when we pray, the change occurs in ourselves. He said, when he was asked, you're praying to change that person? He says, I don't pray to change the other person, but to change me. It changes us. It conforms us to become more like Jesus. I believe that's one of the reasons why Jesus asks us to pray for our enemies, because we cannot continue to pray for them and be the same and look at them the same way. Maybe that sounds too hard for you, for me. Maybe your enemy is someone who has really hurt you, like an abuser, somebody who has or is harming you right now. If that's the case, I want to encourage you to pray differently. I know how hard it is to pray for somebody that you consider an enemy and ask God to bless them. Pray prayers on your enemy that places judgment, God's judgment, God's justice. But pray that they're in His hands, not yours. Because that's God's job to deliver the justice, to deliver the judgment. It's not ours. We're just called to pray for our enemies. So pray for your enemies by placing their future in God's hands, not yours. And third, act generously toward your enemies. Act generously. Live into this call, this challenging call on our lives to generously love our enemies. It isn't enough to think on these things just with an internal attitude. It's necessary for us to put them in action. And maybe that as simple as getting coffee for this coworker you can't stand. Maybe that's a beginning. This is a big thing Jesus is asking us to do. It's huge. But we have to take Jesus' words seriously. And He says, love your enemies. It's not going to be easy, but it's worth it because it changes us and it changes the world around us. When we love generously without expecting return payment, we establish God's kingdom on earth and we resemble a child of Him. Let me close with this. There's a story from recent years that sort of embodies this idea of loving our enemies. In 2019, there was an off-duty officer, some of you might remember this article, and Amber Geiger, and she entered into Botham Jean's apartment thinking it was her own apartment, and she shot and killed him. In the courtroom, after being sentenced to 10 years in prison for murder, Botham's younger brother Brant took the stand. And while looking at and addressing this woman who murdered his brother, he acknowledged the pain that she had caused, but then said he hoped that she goes to God with all the guilt and pain that she had caused. And then he says, I forgive you. That he loves her just like anyone else, and that he wanted the best for her, and that she should give her life to Christ. If anyone could be considered an enemy, Amber was surely Brant's for murdering his brother. Yet at that moment, he chose to live in Jesus' words and love his enemy generously without expecting any return payment. Maybe you and I could be that brave, could be that Christ-like in loving our enemies the same way. Christ gave us an example. And whenever we look at it, we should remember, love your enemies generously without return payment. And our example is the cross that we celebrate each week. So as we celebrate communion together, let's think about the words that Jesus said.